I would love to start at the beginning. Let's talk about let's start kind of with the current state of the NRL, the National Rugby League, and how it was determined and decided that there would be an 18th team, and then maybe lead into how you guys got together to decide to make this bid.
Yeah, I would actually take a step back and say there were 16 teams, and recently a 17th team has joined the Redcliffe Dolphins out of Brisbane. So suddenly you end up with an odd number of teams in a competition, and that results in bye weeks and things like that. I would say that the expansion is probably going to be more than 18. What we've been told is it's probably going to be 18, 19, and 20. So potentially,
Over what time frame? Over how long are we talking?
nobody has indicated any time frames at the moment, but we're working that the first team is probably 26, and maybe 19 and 20 will come in 2 years later in 28.
Okay. So to be clear, the bid that you guys are making is for the 2026 slot.
I would say we are getting organized, and we are certainly will be. If we don't get the 26 slot, we will certainly be at the races for the 28, where the 19th and 20th come into the table.
Okay, cool. So let's talk about that 2026 slot. So how did you guys as a team kind of form? How did you get together and decide, all right, this is a bid, this is something we can make happen?
I would say that we are very much a grassroots team. The key thing with professional sport is you can never forget where your players come from. And if it isn't for the 5-year-olds running around playing your sport, you're never going to end up with those pro athletes playing in the Super Bowl or the World Cup final. So ours is very much a grassroots bid, and it started with Canterbury Rugby League. For those of you who are not familiar with the New Zealand South Island, Canterbury is the largest province, and the main city on the South Island, Christchurch, is in the middle of Canterbury. So we started with Canterbury Rugby League. So our CEO, Tony, used to be the chair of Canterbury Rugby League. And our team has grown from that. And we have what I would describe as rugby league royalty as our president, a gentleman called Frank Endicott. Frank was the head coach of New Zealand Rugby League. He also coached the Warriors, which is the team on the North Island that you mentioned earlier. And he also coached in the UK in Super League and coached both Wigan and Widnes. And above all, he's actually a life member of New Zealand Rugby League as well. So we've got an iconic patriarch in Frank as our president. We have a leading politician on our team, a lady called Otto Williams, who was the minister in the last Labour government here in New Zealand. And the rest of us, I would describe as rugby league enthusiasts. We have a saying, rugby league is more than a game, and it definitely is more than a game. It goes right to the grassroots of our communities.
And do you have some former players on your team as well? Like, did you play?
I played the other code. So there are two codes of rugby league with 13 players and rugby union with 15. You can't tell from my accent because I've got the flu, but I actually hail from the UK. I come from a small place called Cornwall in the UK. And I was lucky enough to play for England schoolboys and England under 21s in the other code.
Yeah. So for those who don't know, there are two types of rugby. There's rugby league and rugby union. They sound similar. They are very different. And you definitely don't want to confuse the two with fans. To be clear, we are talking about rugby league. So let's talk a little bit about this bidding process. How does this work? How does the bidding process work? When are the key events? Yeah, tell us a little bit about that.
As you can imagine, that we have been in touch with the organising body, which is the NRL, National Rugby League, based out of Sydney. We've been in contact with the chairman and the CEO. We have actually asked, is there what I would call an RFP process? And we've been informed that in the next month, so probably by the beginning of July, we will receive details of how a process will work and how the timelines will work. Because without that, it's a little bit like standing in the dark. We can certainly look at previous submissions from other organizations who were in the process when the Redcliffe Dolphins won their bid. And recently, the other code, Rugby Union, expanded and they had a bid process as well. So we can look at what others have done, take the templates, and I would say it's far more than a box ticking exercise. There's an awful lot of work and analysis that goes in here. If there are roadmaps, then let's use the roadmaps that exist. Let's not try and create our own without, that I'm a firm believer in let's not create the wheel if the wheel exists somewhere.
So let's talk about that wheel then. Let's talk about the roadmap. Like, what in your mind are the keys to success to making this bid happen?
I'm a firm believer business, sport, everything is around two things: people and communications. And if you get the people right and you get your communication right, you're on your way. Yes, money is always important, but if you've got the wrong people, you're not going anywhere with how, irrespective of how much money you've got.
Let's talk a little bit about why this opportunity is so special. There's a couple of things happening here in the background that I think we should touch on. So one is just the pure enthusiasm and zeal for the sport in New Zealand, and like the vast difference between how much love there is for New Zealand, for rugby in New Zealand, and the fact that there's only one rugby league team. That's pretty significant. What are your thoughts on that?
That is a huge question, and I would say many, many books have been written about that. And without straying into racism or anything like that, rugby league lends itself to the island community in terms of its speed, its ball handling, and what's involved. Rugby league has a flair, and a lot of it is off the cuff. Rugby union is very structured. You have scrums and lineouts, and probably lends itself more to the Anglo-Saxon type of person. Now, why has there only ever been one team in New Zealand? Well, probably the easiest way to answer the question is over 40% of the players in the NRL, and bearing in mind 16 of the 17 clubs are Australian, over 40% of those players come from New Zealand. So our players are going to play for the Australian teams in big numbers. Now, you're probably not aware, but they are now introducing simultaneously a new league for women. So this is going to be big in its own right, which I think most people underestimate. Where I come from, our women have been tremendously successful, and our women have been the national New Zealand champions for 11 years on the bounce. So we can see that we've got a strong pipeline of female athletes coming through. I think if we can keep our athletes in New Zealand, it is far better than them heading offshore to Australia.
That's interesting. Yeah, 40% of folks that play are from New Zealand to begin with. I mean, presumably they'd rather stay within New Zealand, and yeah, that's really interesting. Now, I want to talk about the women's league as well. Before we get there, I wanted to touch on, just kind of take a step back and just talk about how rugby teams make money, right? So I mean, really, it comes down to the primarily in my understanding, it's the media rights. And this is a big topic right now in the U.S. The NBA is in the process of renewing their media rights contract, which actually includes the WNBA, which is really interesting. But they're getting a lot of money for this, and it's actually fascinating because they're kind of flat, right? The NBA isn't really growing, but they're kind of piggybacking off of a lot of the streaming wars that are happening, and basically just splitting their rights among, I think, 4 different streaming networks, platforms. But that's neither here nor there. Let's talk about the media rights landscape for the NRL. How does that work today? And yeah, just kind of let's start at the beginning there.
Yeah, I would say it's a subject that I'm not donkey deep into, but let me give you the high level. Basically, and without disclosing commercial secrets, each NRL team gets a grant or an allocation of the TV revenues. That is a sizable amount of money. By the time you add in the crowds, looking at our business plan, I'm not going to say it's impossible to lose money, but if you're careful and you know what you're doing, and we do operate with a salary cap as well, providing you get an average crowd, and an average crowd is not that high. Let's say it's 12 to 15,000. There's absolutely, I would believe, and I am an accountant, a very strong possibility that you should be making money here.
So let's talk about the most profitable rugby teams. What are the most profitable NRL teams, and what are they doing right? What do they do well, aside from, getting their slice of the media rights? What about ticket sales, merchandise? What else are they doing really, really well operationally?
Once again, we need to take a step back and compare the two codes. Rugby union is very much more the middle and upper class sport. Your average rugby union person is probably going to be voting right wing. With rugby league, it's very much a working class sport. And your average rugby league fan is going to probably be voting left wing. I mean, those are wide sweeping statements. So you're actually aiming at a mass market as opposed to a specialized market. If you were trying to advertise things like Mercedes and BMW and Volvo, you would be advertising through rugby union. If you were looking to mass market products such as Ford cars, General Motors cars, you would do that through rugby league. The fast food chains, your McDonald's, your KFCs, and all of this, certainly like the offering that is coming from rugby league. So it's not just, I would say, not just the TV rights, it's certainly sponsorship revenues are significant here. And it's aimed at, I would say, eyeballs of people of the mass market.
Interesting. That's an interesting framing. Which league is tougher?
Both will say they both will claim they are both are. I would say it's not easy to cross over between the two sports. That being said, on the women's side, they do seem to cross over quite easily. But particularly in what we call the scrums are very different in the two sports. And if you watch the two scrums comparing each other, you would see the difference. Anybody would see the difference straight away.
Let's talk a little bit about the other bids. I want to get into what's happening across the bidding landscape. So there's bids coming in from two other key places. One is Perth, Western Australia, and one is Papua New Guinea. I'd love to break down both of those locations and, one by one, talk about, why kind of they aren't as strong of a bid as South Island, New Zealand.
I'm going to turn the question around because I'm a firm believer that competition needs to be respected and understood. And I would never go out and say negative things about the competition. Their bids are different to ours. I would say around the Papua New Guinea bid, there are all sorts of political interests in play, whether it's the United States, whether it's China, whether it's the Australia. We can't compete with, political interests of Australia, China, and the USA. So, I would say that is a very different bid to what we're trying to do, homegrown, grassroots pathways for kids playing rugby league in New Zealand. If I look at the Western Australia bid in Perth, Perth is built on mining, gold, diamonds. The Western Australian government is extremely wealthy, and there are some very wealthy people in Perth, way more wealthy than the people we have in New Zealand. If all of those people throw their weight behind their bid, the one thing that they do have is money. Now, I go back to my thing that my first thing that I always look at is people. Yeah, we certainly cannot compete with Western Australia on money. So I would say the bids are different. There are different dynamics in place. Which one is better, which one is not, that is ultimately the decision of the NRL to decide. I would actually say it comes down to number of eyeballs watching on TV. And I would say reality is all three would probably be equal on the number of additional eyeballs that are going to be watching on TV.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, culturally though, it does seem like, the South Island bid has a little bit maybe of a stronger case. I mean, like you said, it's complicated with Papua New Guinea, for example. There's this geopolitical reasons to have a team there that are very difficult to compete against. But at the same time, it doesn't, for lack of a better word, like feel as right of a place within the sport to have a team, in PNG before a second team in New Zealand and the first team on the South Island. This is all anecdotal. This is just from my observation, but it does feel like the South Island. It feels like it should be the logical maybe like next location. And it's not just anecdotes too. There's a tailwind we need to talk about here, which is the background behind me, which clearly I am actually in this stadium, as you can tell. It's definitely not a fake picture, but the stadium is the Tikaha Stadium in Christchurch, and this is a new stadium that is under development. It's being built as we speak, and I'd love to talk a little bit about that. Tell us more about this stadium and kind of how it came to be, and how you guys are kind of piggybacking off of this to help your bid.
Okay. Well, we'll wind the clock back to February 2011. February 2011, Christchurch unfortunately suffered a massive earthquake. I think 185 people died. And over the last 12, 13 years, Christchurch is steadily being rebuilt. I would describe them as two temples that need rebuilding. Number one is the cathedral in the centre of town, and the rugby stadium, Lancaster Park. That was totally stuffed by the earthquake. So for the last 10 or 12 years, the rugby union and rugby league teams have been playing in what I can only describe as a prefab made of scaffolding. And it probably was aimed to last 3 years, but it's still there and they're still playing in it. Geographically, Christchurch is very close to the Southern Alps. You can ski within an hour of being in Christchurch. In the winter, when you're sitting outside, well, think of Green Bay, think of Buffalo. It gets pretty cold, and the wind comes down across from the Southern Alps and blasts straight into this prefab stadium. So the city is rebuilding the cathedral, and the city is now rebuilding the stadium. The new stadium will house 25,000 people, not big by US standards, not big by European standards, but certainly big by our standards. But more significantly, the stadium will have a roof. This will be the first stadium in the NRL with a roof, which then guarantees the quality of the playing surface, and more importantly, guarantees the fan experience, the game day experience. So yes, the new stadium will be something special. The rugby union team will probably be playing something like 8 home games a year maximum. There is a second rugby union team, and they'll probably end up playing 5 or 6. Having a stadium where you're only playing around about 10 or 12 home games a season is not sustainable. And therefore, bringing the rugby league team to the party, who potentially will have something like 14 home games as well, that will double the number of fixtures that the new stadium will have within it. So, yeah, certainly we've got strong support from the Christchurch City Council on what we're up to.
compared to the other bids, what does the infrastructure situation look like? I mean, presumably a stadium would need to be built in PNG. What would they be planning on doing from a funding perspective? What are they thinking of doing over in Perth? How does that all work?
PNG, I would say, don't have a stadium of suitable standard at the moment. But when you've kind of got the Australian government and the PNG government and everybody, and there's a significant sponsor that is considering helping them build a stadium. So the PNG situation, yeah, I think they will get a stadium fairly shortly. Yeah, and as far as Perth is concerned, they have one of the world's leading state-of-the-art stadiums over there in the Opus Stadium that holds about 65,000 people, is used for Test cricket, and is also used for Aussie rules.
Earlier, you mentioned that your bid was grassroots, and I want to talk a little bit about the grassroots nature of what's happening here, specifically when it comes to the supply, right, of players. So, I mean, this is one of the interesting things. I mean, you mentioned that 40% of the players already come from New Zealand, anyways, in the NRL, right? So, how are you guys kind of leveraging that and also encouraging new supply to come up from the when folks are young and to make their way into the NRL and hopefully into the team?
Well, it comes down to club and club footy, club rugby league. The area in the North Island where I come from, we have some very large clubs. So I have some clubs that have got over 1,000 players. The key is that the clubs are very family orientated. So, dad plays, mum plays, and the kids play. And, the kids are playing probably from the age of 4 or 5. I certainly played my first game by the time I was 5. It becomes part of your weekly ritual to go off and play. Mum may play on Sunday, my dad may play on Saturday, and the kids either, in the evenings or whatever. So the infrastructure's there, the clubs are there, the players are there. You could argue that in Perth, they're not in the similar situation with Western Australia. I definitely wouldn't argue that PNG Rugby League is actually the national sport. So I would say they have certainly got grassroots sorted out in the same way that we have.
Interesting. That's interesting. Let's talk about the women's NRL. So women's sports in general can be severely underrated. This is happening in the US right now, where like the WNBA, for example, is growing by leaps and bounds. It's always struck me actually how much bigger women's sports are in general in Australasia compared to the US. Let's talk about how that relates to rugby. So, what's the relationship between the women's team and the men's team as it pertains to this bid? So, like, what I mean by that is, if you guys were to win the bid, does the women's team get formed as well by default? How does that kind of work?
I wouldn't say formed automatically by default. There's a lot of work involved in creating a women's team as well as a men's team. And one should not underestimate it at all.
Let's talk about the funding. So, what is the amount that you guys are looking to raise and kind of at each phase, at each step, right? So, what's the total amount you're looking to raise for this? And what's the immediate amount you're looking to raise? And more importantly, how will the funds be deployed at each stage of this operation?
It's a very good question. We don't actually know how much money we need, and hopefully that will become clearer in the RFP, the pitch material that we're requested to put together. But we're working on a figure of around about 35 million Australian dollars. Ultimately, that's what we need. Now, to get started, I would say we need seed capital. The seed capital is really to get us to the point where we win the bid. So we have an enthusiastic group of volunteers who are working for the love of the game at the moment. We can only take this so far. We certainly need professional help and advice. we can convince the professional advisors and stuff to work at discounted rates whilst we're in the seed process. But we still estimate that we probably need about $500,000 to get ourselves to a point where we have a bid on the table.
So $500,000 Australian is enough to bring the bid to the NRL.
Yeah.
So you don't need the full 35 million to win the bid. You need
no, we need that to have that on. We need that to get to the point of the bid, and then to actually win the bid. What we're being told is that we need to have visibility that the NRL can see our pathway to the $35 million.
Okay, got it. So that's what I was going to ask next. So that pathway, presumably they and investors will want to know how you're planning to deploy those funds once you raise them as well, right? So, I mean, I would imagine that's part of the bid as well. It's not just the ability to raise 35, but how it's going to be deployed. What are your kind of early thoughts about that? How does, operationally speaking, where do the funds flow?
For the 35, and Kieran, you may need to step in here. The 35 million, my understanding, is more like a security bond to make sure that the money is parked so that if anything happens, then the NRL has got some security around their IP, everything that they've done. So looking at all the numbers that we've got, I would say the business should be pretty much cash neutral or profitable fairly early. And the 35 mil is very much there as a backstop. Kieran, is that your understanding?
Yeah, I think you explained it perfectly. The other aspect here would be if we get a license in year 2026, it's different from if we get a license in 2028, but it depends on when we'll know when that license is issued. So if we got the go ahead tomorrow for 2028, we have 4 years of where we have to prepare and incur costs. Whereas if we got the go ahead for 2026, it's a much different scenario. So we would be looking at drawing down, but from the data that we've analyzed today, we don't see it as being a significant outlay up to that first season. But then there is a period where we have to start contracting players, bringing a coach on. So we would have some upfront costs.
Got it. And so if you win the bid, when is the NRL saying that the team has to start, right? Like, what is it for the 2026 season, or is that still to be determined?
Yeah, so that's the $1 million, or I guess the $30 million question right now is which teams will be next and what timeline. There is some discussion that the NRL might consider bringing 3 teams in at the same time. The interesting aspect is if you read reports coming out of Sydney right now, Papua New Guinea will arguably be next, given the Australian federal government's involvement. But then you have to look at the Papua New Guinea context to see if they're actually ready to go in 2026. So they might not be ready to go from a safety and security aspect. So there could be a scenario where the 18th license is awarded to Papua New Guinea, but they still need another team to come in 2026 season and start straight away. So that's where we could potentially win the 19th license, but we could start in 2026 in advance of the 18th license.
Interesting. So to be clear, if you win the bid, it's generally expected to be a 2026 start for all intents and purposes. If you don't win the bid, the NRL is still expanding, and there is still a opportunity to become the 19th team or the 20th team or the 21st team or the 22nd team.
Based on information we have today, there is a broadcasting agreement which is being renegotiated in 2027 for year 2028. And with 3 additional teams, it brings more content for broadcasters and allows them to negotiate a larger agreement all round. So the ideal vision is they get to 20 teams and have a sustainable model where player development isn't diluted across the teams and ultimately results in a lower grade product. The idea is to do it in a sustainable way, ultimately driving more content to allow more viewership across the board while promoting and expanding the game and really developing it as the leading sport in Australasia, which is already at the top of across multiple metrics.
Thank you. And so let's quickly but importantly discuss what investors are receiving for an investment. We also should talk about, generally speaking, the minimums you're looking for this stage, and what investors are actually investing in, what they're getting.
So we essentially see two different scenarios. We have our period up until submitting a bid to the NRL, where hopefully we ultimately get the green light to go ahead. So we see this as a very high risk period. There's opportunity for large return on investment, but this is a period where we have some risk. We might have a scenario where they come back and say, no, we're no longer expanding to 19th, 20th, and we're only expanding to 18th, and Papua New Guinea is getting the 18th license. This could happen. Ultimately, all the data that we've seen is suggesting there will be a 20-team competition, and the South Island will definitely be a part of that, along with Perth and Papua New Guinea. So we're confident based on the data involved. This is why we're all doing this as volunteers, that we can get to this pathway and we will be the best product coming out of the South Island. So what do we see in terms of return on investment in that high risk stage? We're working on the basis of a convertible note by New Zealand's #1 sports law firm, to where we will offer the value which Cole mentioned before, around the 500,000 Australian, which we're looking to raise, that it will be on conversion later on and moving into the NRL and we're successful. That early investment now in the slightly more high risk stage will see a discount on shares later on. So if people jump on board with us now, they'll be able to purchase shares later on at a discounted rate, which can be negotiated at later on when we see how everything plays out from a club perspective. There will be availability to come on and purchase more shares, ideally once a license is issued to the South Island. Cole, anything else on your side?
No, I would say that that's it in a nutshell. The early stage investment, that seed $500,000, put my accountant's hat back on again, and I would say yes, it's definitely risky.
It'd be wrong for us to not disclose that as well. I think the bigger question is, I mean, investing in a sports team is the reward can be tremendous. The question is, is it worth the risk and over what time horizon? So I think one question I would have is, if this bid doesn't go through, if someone were to invest today, right, and help out with the $500,000 raise, does that apply to the future inevitable bids that will happen in 2027, 2028, depending on how the cookie crumbles with the NRL? But is this, in terms of like the level of risk, is it like if this bid fails, that the investment only applied to this bid, or does it apply to future bids?
I would say it applies to future bids whilst this team is in action and up and running. And bear in mind that we started with our foundations as the grassroots game. The grassroots game in South Island is not going to go away tomorrow. It's not going to go away ever.
Right.
So I would say that providing that we're all there, which we will be, and this will carry on applying to every bid until we run out of energy or what, we're not able to actually put a bid in.
So it's a marathon. This is a marathon, not just a sprint, right? It's a sprint for now, and it's a marathon in the long run. What is the sprint deadline, right? Like, what is when does the bid have to be submitted by for 2026?
We don't know. So we're being told that a process will come out in the next month or so.
Interesting. So you guys are in touch with the NRL. There's just a lot of back and forth. They're still trying to figure stuff out. It's a fascinating process.
Yeah, it's an unusual process. But I joke that you play the golf ball where it lands, and that's what we're having to do.
Well, it's a fascinating investment opportunity. I mean, this stuff doesn't come along very often, and I want to say thank you both for your time, and we'll be rooting for you guys. We'll be watching closely, and hopefully we can make this thing happen and make this stadium full of all sorts of South Island fans in the near future. So, gentlemen, thank you once again.
No, thank you.
Amazing. Thanks, Stefan.